Hey everybody, thanks for joining me on another On This Day in Canadian History live stream. Today going to be a bit of a different one. I've had the idea of doing this like a while ago. I've been thinking about doing something like this for quite a while. So it's something that I've been pondering a lot, and it's been part of my academic work and part of things I'm doing with digital history and this YouTube channel, all of that. So I'm going to kind of explain my thinking behind it, how I got to this point, bring up some examples, and of course, at any point you have any questions, comments, please do leave them sidebar. If you want to chat on here, we can do that too. I can send you a link if you'd like, and you can jump on real quick if you feel the desire to do so. I'm fully open to that because there's no real structure other than kind of how I want to talk about it, but this can go anywhere. Again, we had a lot of success and a lot of good feedback from the Remembrance Day live stream about those remembering people they wanted to remember, talk about Canadian history generally. So this one's an interesting one because defeats are not just Canadian. I mean, that's how I got to this topic and thinking about it a lot and all of that. So there's some trends in Canada I want to talk about, but there's some more international trends, more broad trends, all of that kind of stuff. So that's definitely something I want to talk about and all that fun stuff. So we'll see. Alex, yeah, thanks. That's yeah, eat your poutine. That's far more important right now. That's for sure. Especially feeling ultra Canadian as of I am today, because Ottawa got its first good blanket of snow this year. So that's of the season. So it's making me feel quite Canadian today. So this is something, again, like I just said, very interesting to me. And yes, a lot of you know. Hey, Romain, how's it going? Good to see you on here. So this is something I've been thinking about in terms of Canada, but more broadly for a while. Now, as a lot of you know, I did my dissertation on the Battle of Hong Kong. And of course, that's a defeat for those of you who are even the most, tangential understanding of Canada's Second World War, know about that battle and all that entails. Now, why that is important is, and just how I said that, right? It's even if you know a little bit or hardly anything at all, you still probably know about Hong Kong. I mean, I've talked to all kinds of people over the last, however long I've been doing this now, 6 years, about my topic and all of that, and I get a lot of the same reactions. Like, oh, it's terrible. Oh no, they were sent there when they should have known better. They were sent as sacrifices, all that good stuff. So it's the same things I hear the same things over and over again. The nuance is quite lacking. So that's something interesting. So now I'll just say this off the hop, and I've run into some resistance from various people, rightfully so. I mean, that's academic discourse. That's how it should go. That Canada has almost this, obsession, a fascination, as I titled this, with defeats, particularly in the Second World War, because that's my base of knowledge. This is where this started. Obviously, I know more than just the Second World War, especially now with all the work I do, but this is a different one. So this is kind of how I started into it. So people have also asked, like, well, isn't your work just, doing more of the same, focusing on the defeat part, perpetuating this kind of myths, all of that, all of the same stuff, right? Like other people have done, other documentaries that have done this. We'll probably end up talking about that a little bit, but there's that. So it's something hard to counter because that is not the case of how I came to this topic and what I tried to do with it. Yes, undeniably, it's a defeat. It's a major defeat. I mean, for Canadians and the garrison generally. And yeah, Alex, that's a good point. We'll get there, but just it's a really good point, and I'll show that in a second. But this one, in particular, Hong Kong, it's a major defeat for Canadians at the time. Lots of controversy, lots of outrage and anger, rightfully so. But also the amount of casualties, right? It's literally almost 100% casualties, right? In the terms of killed, wounded, prisoners of war. Few people escape, so it's not technically 100%. Technically, but it's pretty close. I haven't done the math, but it's pretty close. So that's part of this. But why I came to the subject, and a few of you know this, and I've talked to you, a few of you people watching today, and others who may be watching in the future, of why I do this topic and why I picked it. It's not because of the defeat. I wasn't interested in the defeat part of it. I know that sounds probably a little weird, but it's true. Yeah, and Norma, you're right. We'll get there, but we'll get there. It's part of the thumbnail, so we'll get there. Norma is I picked it because it's a Pacific topic, not because it's a defeat. It's a Pacific topic. As some of you know, my background is American studies, actually not Canadian history, which is quite interesting. I think it broadens my understandings. But that being said, I focused on Pearl Harbor, which the anniversary is also coming up and going to be part of the chat today. And I focused on, the impact that Pearl Harbor had on Hawaii in and of itself. So that's a different way of looking at Pearl Harbor, right? Normally talk about at least the U.S. joining the war, all that stuff. It's not really looked at it, kind of that, that macro level of this U.S. territory that eventually becomes a state. Anyway, so I wanted to do that, keep doing that sort of vein, that topic, World War II, Pacific. I was going to do something with the Americans, talked about this other places. You can get into that. Anyway, we can get into that on other things. I talk about this on another cast, like the Juno Beach Center podcast coming up in other places. So I don't want to talk about that. But so I want to do Canada. I switched to Canada, and the Pacific is quite, barren as far as Canadian involvement, right, on a larger scale. Like I said, other places, there's individual, aviators. There's small involvement from the Navy, one or two, like one ship, literally, which is an interesting story, but it's hard to do a dissertation on just that. There's things like Kiska, which is a whole other thing, which has already been written on, who became my supervisor. So I didn't touch that one. So that really left Hong Kong. And I had been out of school for a while. Research skills were a little rusty. So I started doing some digging, and things popped up. There's this huge controversy about Hong Kong, not just about the defeat itself, which is part of this, but also the historiography behind it is its own fight that's been going on for almost, you can argue, since the 60s, maybe even before that. I mean, it's fascinating. My dissertation talks about that at length. But that's why I came to this. There's this Pacific aspect that I think Canada needs to focus more on. Us as a Pacific nation, just generally, I mean, poli-sci, economically, politically, across academics, personal, and, public life. I think it's just so many areas that we don't focus on. So, yeah, and this is a good point, Alex, actually, that there's 3 Canadian VCs in the war against Japan. It's true. It's extremely outproportioned to what happens. So that's a really, really interesting way to think about it. So that's why I got here. I wanted to talk about that debate of Hong Kong. I started digging into the sources, and they're not great. I mean, I talked about this other places. I'm doing an AMA on Hong Kong on the 8th, so look out for that. Come join us for that. I don't want to spend too much time today on Hong Kong because I want to save it for then and for the other podcasts and everything else coming out. So save your really, really, really Hong Kong questions for that time, if you don't mind. So it's still part of this, and I can talk about it, but it's going to be like the focus of that one. So this one is more of a broad kind of understanding. So obviously going into this stuff, Hong Kong, right? You start reading different articles, you look at the timelines, all that fun stuff. It's hard to, miss the big things like Dieppe very soon after, right, of Hong Kong. These 2 twin major defeats come basically within 6 months of each other. So that's huge. And it's an important part of the Canadian war effort. So it's something I couldn't avoid. Dieppe has a small place in my dissertation, a very, very small place, but it does come up because it's unavoidable. I wanted to do initially more with that, but I couldn't because it didn't really quite fit. So there's that. Yeah, it's Air Fleet, or Alex, you're right. Yeah, and I think he was volunteer reserve. Anyway, get distracted. That's going to probably happen today. But so there's that element that I'm talking about here, is this Dieppe part of it, and that's something that needs to be focused on as well, because as a lot of you know who are watching now live and probably later. Sorry, Romy, I just read your comment. Sorry, it's gonna be a lot of distraction today. I mean, sorry, this is a pretty good one. There's a few things. Yeah, there's a few with France's military history there, and part of them, good chunk of them, intersect with Canada, which we'll talk about. But one that probably doesn't get talked about too much in France. Maybe, I don't know. We'll find out. Anyway, so Dieppe's part of this. There's a whole new historiography trend on that, which is fascinating. A lot of you know David O'Keefe, who's working on this area. There's a new book that I did a review on about, Dieppe. It's called, Operation Jubilee. It's right here next to me. It's literally got the folly and the sacrifice in the title. So that's a major trend. Hong Kong is the same thing. It's the same sort of thing. The titles are like, not the slightest chance, the damned, literally one's called that, and all this stuff. So there's this element of defeat. So why I talked about Dieppe in the dissertation is because of how the views have changed and the way we interpret these things, right? There's all different ways to always do this. It's something I'll say, you're probably right. He does, and I mean, I don't blame him. I mean, it is fascinating and it's good, but maybe we can talk about kind of the why the fascination happens in certain ways. But anyway, sorry, I just want to do my opening spiel and then we'll just kind of go with it. But so anyway, yeah. So I came to Dieppe in a different way, and this is that it's got a changing historiography. Whereas I argue Hong Kong, that hasn't happened, right? A lot of you, and this comes from Tim Cook's idea in his latest book, Fight for History, which is great. And I've linked it multiple times. I can probably link it afterwards as well, but where to get it, I highly suggest it, is that Canada's done a better job of remembering its Second World War. For decades, it was not doing anything. It was missing so much. Like for decades, right? Hardly talked about, no big monument like we have for the First World War, nothing like that. So he argues that this has now changed, right? Especially after 1994 with the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landings and then the things that happened in the Netherlands in 95. All this stuff started getting more attention. Hong Kong slipped through the cracks, I argue, through all of that. It's still that negative. It's still bad, all that stuff. So sorry, one second here. So there was that element, but Hong Kong doesn't come into this, I would argue. Still hasn't. Still only viewed as completely negative. And one of the things I wanted to talk about today is how Hong Kong isn't necessarily or should be thought of like this. It shouldn't be. There's lots of positives to take out of Dieppe. It shouldn't just be the negatives. I'm not saying that the things that went bad shouldn't be talked about. We shouldn't examine what happened in an academic or any way. That's not what I'm saying. I've been accused of that numerous times, and I never have said that. I don't know if some of that's just academic rigor, some of it's just ignorance. I don't know, but I've had to defend against that a lot. And as Alex has already pointed out, there was a VC awarded at Hong Kong, the only one, to a Canadian. Osborne, Robert Osborne, won one for self-sacrifice, literally save lives by jumping on a grenade. Like, to me, that's the things we should be talking about as well. Also, one thing that is extremely controversial, and I tweeted out earlier, there's going to be some controversial opinions today from myself and probably others, is that we should try to remember the good that was being done with the reinforcement of Hong Kong. We only knew it was a mistake in hindsight. Yes, we can say all this stuff about what happened. We knew it was going to happen. They didn't know it was going to happen. You can't say that. You can't say that that's a certainty. And why this is important, and kind of still doing my little opening talk here, is I looked at Iceland. For those of you who might not know, the Allies literally just occupied Iceland. It was under Danish control. Until, of course, they were occupied by the Germans. So the Allies at the time, which still in the United States wasn't at war, but might as well have been in this case, are okay with occupying Iceland. So they need troops to do so. So they come to the Canadians. Well, there's more debate about sending troops to Iceland, like 4 or 5 times more, literally, than there was about Hong Kong, which is just so fascinating to me. They're talking about sending small amounts, like I'm talking about less than a brigade, to this tiny little island that's not likely to be invaded. And they knew that at the time because they were talking about it. There was possibilities, but they're worried about things like the naval war and all of that. Talking about that could happen. And they're fighting against it and all of that. Talking about this in the War Cabinet Committee multiple times, over and over again, different opinions, different views, they're all talked about. Hong Kong's not talked about in that way. They're not worried about a war. They don't think a war is coming. They're trying to stop one from coming, and Hong Kong's part of that. They want Hong Kong to be part of the deterrence. And why this is important is because the United States and Britain were both doing this, right? Britain obviously asked Canada for Hong Kong, send troops to Hong Kong to reinforce. Again, we can talk about that later, but also, or on the AMA show. So, but also the United States was reinforcing the Philippines with a lot of troops and a lot of new shiny equipment, B-17s especially. They were sending most of their production to the Philippines to try and stop an amphibious landing. Obviously, it didn't work, but they were still trying. Britain tried a lot of places, right? The amount of reinforcements poured into Singapore, which is another major defeat that gets tons of attention. And I think rightfully so. I think it's an interesting story in terms of what happens and all of that stuff. It's also reinforced by the Australians, the Brits, by the British Indian Army. Like there's tons of troops being poured in there, and this is happening well before this request comes to Canada. So they're saying, okay, yeah, we should do some more. Some of them said this literally. Ralston, the defense minister, says this. We're not doing enough, right? But the Army's not doing enough. Not talking about the Air Force and the Navy, which are obviously contributing. Talking about the Army. The Army needs to do something. King is against it. Obviously, there's been some talk about King already. He's wanting to avoid a Pacific War. He wants to avoid war anywhere. He doesn't want Canadians fighting on the ground anywhere. He just doesn't want that because he doesn't want conscription, because he fears he'll lose his power base in Quebec, and then his government will fall apart. He's scared of that. So that's part of this. But also he goes along with it because he sees it as a little contribution. I mean, 2 battalions isn't much in the grand scheme of things, so he goes along with it. But also one of the things I want to harp today is, and this is going to come up with some other things I want to talk about, is what is taken from defeat, right? Lots of things are taken from it. There's all of these elements that are taken from it. I'm not even talking about Canadian in this case. I'm talking about international, all of this different stuff. There's all kinds of defeats, and they're viewed differently than Canada. That is the major point I will argue today. That if the purpose of today's paper is to argue, is that Canada does look at things a little differently in terms of these defeats. I would argue, based on just history and my understanding of all of this. It's a fascinating thing. So, but also coming back to Hong Kong, I think there's positives to be taken from it. The Canadian troops fought better than is popularly thought. I mean, the documentary evidence shows that there is problems, but also there is lots of things to be celebrated and all of that stuff. And again, this comes from veterans themselves. I've talked to them and their families about all this stuff. So it's an interesting one. But again, maybe we can get to that later. So I want to expand a little bit. So what else comes into this? I talked about Dieppe. That's the other Canadian major defeat we talk about a lot in Canada and even beyond, right? Like I just mentioned, Patrick Bishop book. He's not Canadian. It's not by a Canadian publisher. There's that. And then there's the other ones. Bomber Command, which is, it's hard to say it's a defeat, right? But the casualty numbers are huge. They're massive from Bomber Command throughout the war. And it's talked about a lot in that sense, but it's not seen as a defeat. I'm not saying it is a defeat. I'm not saying it's a victory either. It's an attritional campaign. You can't measure that like some sort of land battle. It's not possible. But there's a high number of casualties. And I bring up Bomber Command for a specific reason, and I'll get there. And then another major defeat within, hidden within this major victory, and one of the best, feats of Canadian arms, which is a whole other story about the historiography of this one, is Verrier Ridge. For those of you who don't know about that one, it's about the Black Watch, mostly gets the attention on this one. The Regiment of Montreal, lots of powerful people in the Black Watch through its history, that kind of thing. So they are sent into basically an unwinnable situation and are basically almost wiped out in an afternoon. And it's real, real bad. That one gets a lot of attention. And I do want to wrap up this kind of section by talking about the thing I don't like to talk about. And if you guys have seen me on other things, I get a little riled up about it, but the valor and the horror, these are the 3 areas that are focused on. They did Hong Kong, Bomber Command, Verrier Ridge. They wanted to do Dieppe. I don't remember the reasons why they didn't do it. I think it was too difficult or something. I can't remember. It's all I'm just guessing at this point. But that was going to be when they were going to do it. They ended up doing it because I was looking into the filmmakers, thinking behind this as best I could. I mean, they have some personal papers, but I couldn't get there because of COVID, unfortunately. So there's that element, and something to be talked about is particularly because of the timing of that documentary series and the impact that it has in Canada. It has a huge impact that's very difficult to measure. I'm not saying that you can, but what I'm saying is it is impactful. People still take their talking points about these battles from the valor and the horror, because I talked to them and I now realize this. And it's very interesting that this one documentary series that ran twice on national television has such an impact on how we view this thing and this war and defeat in general, because I think it has a ripple effect. It has this impact at the time it comes out in the early 90s, and then we see that change I already talked about, right, with the anniversaries of the Second World War, the 50th of the Normandy landings, and then the victory, obviously, in 45, is this hugely complex thing that Tim Cook talks about in his book, but it still needs that deep dive. It needs that deep dive on it to understand it. So that's kind of my thinking of all of this. And this was part of the controversy that I looked into, right, with the Valor and the Horror, because that comes up when you put in Battle of Hong Kong pretty much every time. It's one of the top hits. It's unavoidable at this point. I didn't want to do it for my dissertation, but my supervisor, Galen Parra, who's written on Hong Kong and all that stuff, is he just kind of went with it, right? And he's like, you have to. You can't avoid it. It's unavoidable. And he's right. So that's my thinking with this. So that's a big point. So I'm going to just go through. I think I missed some really good stuff here that I may have to come back to later. But again, I want involvement and I want you guys involved. So I'm not going to try to miss here. Yeah, thanks for posting that earlier, Willie. I really appreciate that about the pilot. It's really great to hear. Okay, yes, I'll explain here. So I think this is a good place to kind of diverge a little. So I think you're right. It is something, I think, and it's not fully understood, but I think it is there, is this greatness of the Canadian Corps. They barely lose any battles. I mean, you can argue that differently, depending on how you want to go about it. We can talk about that. But I think it's part of this. I said in my dissertation, I got a lot of flack for it. And I had to change it a little bit. But I said that Canadians at the time of Hong Kong, which I should have cleared up better, but are used to winning, right? Hong Kong comes on the heels, I mean, a generation, but on the heels of the Canadian victories in the First World War, 100 days, right? We don't talk about that now, but they talked about it then, and they were aware of it, obviously. Vimy and all of those other wins. Even Passchendaele was seen as a win, right? Because it was technically. I mean, again, that's murky part of this conversation is defeat and what that even means. Anyway, so that I think that's a big part of this because it impacts the Second World War generation. Obviously, they're raised by the First World War generation, so it's something that cannot be missed in this. And I want to get to that in a second, but I'm just going to come through. Yeah, Great Dominion, good point. Nothing but defeat, really. Late 41, early 42. Well, it's mid 42, really, until basically Coral Sea Midway is defeat after defeat after defeat. And one thing I did want to point out, it's a bit of an aside, is all the major defeats that the Japanese inflicted on the Allies. I don't know for all of them in every tiny little island, I'm not sure. But for the big ones, the Japanese were outnumbered by the garrisons, the Allied garrisons, British, American, what have you, Filipino. Hong Kong is the only one where they were outnumbered by the Japanese. The only big one, right? That the Japanese very much outnumbered the British garrison in all of that. So it's an interesting aside, something to keep in mind, that the troops at Hong Kong were outnumbered, whereas at Singapore, the Commonwealth British garrison outnumbered them. It's still lost by pretty spectacularly. It's really interesting. Yeah. History Underground makes a great point. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate that. Is an American, and I want to get here, is Pearl Harbor in the Philippines. But I want to do like 2 sections, like Canada, and then we'll bust it open. But and let's keep that in mind. I think that's a good one. Talked about the VCs, and I think there's been some talk about what else we got here. We got some other talk about the Royal Canadian Navy. About what that means. I mean, it's complicated. Sorry, I'm just reading it here. Yeah, and here's a good point, and I think this is a good one to talk about because about the Second World War is we couldn't, there's this concept that the Royal Canadian Navy fails, right? Because these U-boats get up the St. Lawrence and into the Gaspé area and sink shipping right off Canadian shores, right? There's stories of people literally watching the shipping getting sunk from the shores of the St. Lawrence. So it's harrowing, right? The Canadians have largely been untouched by war at this point. And to see this was probably a shock for quite a few people, especially these small towns on the coast of the St. Lawrence at the time. It was shocking. But yeah, there's a huge chunk in the literature about, this Royal Canadian failure, but that's beginning to change. Mark Milner, who's been on all kinds of stuff on this, is changing that. And he doesn't get enough attention, recognition. I mean, he's known within the academic community. very well because I met him at conferences that are not in Canada, and we've known each other for a while now. But it's just he's you know. He's very well known, so he should be known more for what the work he's done. And Alice talks about that. And I don't want to speak for Mark Milner, Dr. Milner, but he's done great work with not just Canadian Navy and Navy in general, but Canadians of Normandy. He's really busted that one open too, and all these assumptions about Canadian defeat and lack of leadership, and this whole big mess that I've run into and myth about this, into trouble with people about the SS and then the German eliteness, which makes no sense. Sorry if I offend anyone, but I don't care. The SS were a bunch of murderous bastards, so that's too bad. But anyway, so there's that. He's busted that open in so many ways. It's a really, really interesting work that he's done. So anyway, yeah, Sheldrake, you make a really interesting point, but I want to come back to that later, if that's all right. And yeah, lots of good chat going on in the sidebar. So I do want to go kind of just break away from the comments real quick and talk about another Canadian defeat that is so complicated in terms of its aftermath. And it's a foundational myth in Canada. And it's a myth, it's a fact, it's the Plains of Abraham. If you are Canadian, you know about the Plains of Abraham. It's unavoidable. It's what made Canada, Canada, the Canada that it is today. All right, that leads to hundreds of years of French, English. Obviously, there are other groups in here. I know that. I'm not leaving them out, but this is the perceived myth. It's this French-English conflict, right? That the English, the British, conquer what is then New France at the Plains of Abraham in 1759. And France, again, depends on who you talk to, more or less, how do I say this? It's abandoned New France and the Canadian, as they were called at the time, right? They were the only Canadians at that time calling themselves Canadians, the French Canadians, or Québécois, which is a whole other troublesome term. But French Canadians, as I'll probably say throughout this, because I am French Canadian. I'm not Québécois, I'm French Canadian. There's a difference. But anyway, so France more or less abandons New France to Britain, as some see it, which is interesting. Again, it depends on who you are, but that's a big foundational myth, right? And particularly in Quebec and French Canada today, about losing to the British outside of Quebec City and losing the colony, right? It's not so simple as that, but it happened after a few while. And then, yeah, there's the negotiations afterwards, and then France rather takes on other islands that they lost. So there's that, which is interesting element of that. I can answer some questions about that if there is. But to me, it's something I want to keep in mind because I did miss this when I was writing originally. It's a Canadian defeat because it is a Canadian defeat. It's something that at that point half the population was concerned about. They lost. It's a foundational myth based on loss. And this is why I wanted to mention this, because it kind of breaks open what I wanted to talk about. A lot of people who have their background ancestry from Quebec, or what then became Quebec, it's focused on, and it's a big part of Canada. It still is. We still talk about it. We still misunderstand it. It's one of the few battles that has this sort of connection to both commanders, in the terms of, yes, they're both killed, dramatically so. I mean, Wolfe dies on the battlefield. Montcalm dies a few days later, or the day later. He doesn't die on the battlefield. So it's interesting, and there's a memorial to both of them together. There's not many of those. You're not seeing a Rommel Monty memorial, right? So you got this complicated nature to this topic of Canadian defeat as a foundation of what becomes Canada. So it's a really interesting one, and how something, maybe. Sorry, I'm reading Sheldrake 6. It's a good point. I mean, yes, it's Guadeloupe and Martinique that the French decided to keep, and keeping Canada would have led just to another war. I don't know. I mean, this is in the 1760s. France is at war with Britain again later anyway. Just saying. Yes, I know that's not that simple, but because it's the American Revolution, which spurs the revolutionary/Napoleonic Wars. Maybe they just would have found a reason to fight anyway. I don't know. It seems like that's what was happening, and territorial elements are part of this. but that's what happens. And of course, these are what ifs. But that's where defeat and changes lead. As always, what ifs. So anyway, so why Plains of Abraham is important for today is because of I wanted to bust this open a little bit and kind of get insights from everybody about defeats, because I know we're not all Canadians here today or will be watching in the future. I just did some quick jotting down, some stuff I talked about quite interestingly before today, but also my own work. Is that I want to hear your thoughts, because sometimes we're getting stuck in a little bit of a bubble of military history and national silos. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe you're right. I think you're right. Probably not, but who knows? Anyway, so fair enough. Romaine, fair enough. I mean, nice hats. But, it's Newfoundland screech. That's a thing. Even though it was a British colony. I know, don't jump on me, people. I'm just making a joke. But anyway, so that's it's interesting. So anyway, sorry. Back to what I was saying. Plains of Abraham, foundational myth. Canada doesn't have a foundational myth in that traditional sense, right? Some of the population does, unfortunately, or not fortunately, depending on your opinions. French Canadian is a shrinking population within Canada. I think it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. And I'm, as one of them who doesn't speak French anymore, I can see the concerns. It's not a foundational myth for Canada. It's not. There isn't really one that's like this. And where this is coming from, and I guess I should do this in maybe a little bit of chronological order, but it can go way back, way back. And this is something that I brought up in my dissertation, is this is not just a Canadian thing. I think Canadians, how we do it is different. And maybe we can tie that up at the end. But myth is focused on, defeat is a myth. It's focused on by everyone. There's all kinds of them. A lot of them are still politically charged, emotional. People get upset. One of them that happened, I don't even know, 2,000 years ago now? More, even more than that now. Thermopylae, right? The Spartan, which it wasn't just the Spartans, but the Spartan defeat, by the Persians. It's, lionized to this day. It's had movies made about it. It's become this iconic sort of, I don't even know what the right word is, this weird machismo kind of thing. But anyway, it's still talked about. It's still a foundational myth of the West, right? That the Greeks saved Western civilization, whatever that means. I don't know what that means. But anyway, so that's part of this. It's a good start for the Western world is the way you think about it. It's a foundational defeat that leads to victory. And kind of as part of Greek identity, and I would say Western civilization identity in a large part. Then I do jump forward a little bit. I talk about things like the Light Brigade, charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava and the Crimean War. That's a big one. It still is today, right? It's still talked about. That the Crimean War is not well understood and its impact, particularly on Britain. It's an interesting one. But again, that poem is by Tennyson, is quoted for everything and anything. It applies to so much about this sort of bravery, unquestioningness, but to follow orders and try to seek victory. But why I think it's interesting, and why in these two, Thermopylae and Charge of the Light Brigade, are connected, is yes, this idea of this sacrifice. Yeah, Scott, you've hit that nail pretty much on the head here. It's because of this. It's this noble sacrifice, this fight for the nation, this we're doing this for our country, for the betterment of us, for the betterment of our civilization, or fill in the blank, basically, take your pick. It's part of this, right? It's all part of this. Sorry, I'm just making sure I keep up on if people are trying to get in touch with me. It's part of this. It's a bigger trend. Charge of the Light Brigade is seen as that as well. Really, like Tennyson's poem is cemented the Light Brigade in there. And again, I've got yelled at for this before, but there's a Canadian connection here. I've gotten crap from people who would just like to give people who like to give people crap about saying, "Oh, it's not Canada yet." I'm like, okay, that's not how that works. But there's a Canadian VC one as part of the charge of the Light Brigade. Alexander Dunn wins the VC for saving a few other soldiers as part of this charge. So I always get my Canadian connections in there, and that's an interesting one. But Anyway, Charge of the Light Brigade is one. It's still talked about all the time, particularly Britain, with things that are happening there now. The sort of Britain Marshall view of things is kind of coming back, which is interesting. Again, those myths are connected to other things, and can't really talk about that today, but it's an interesting one, and one I like to keep in mind that we've got going on with talking about defeat generally. And again, you can't deny the connection between Britain and Canada as the world wars are loom large in Canada, right? You can't ignore that, right? It's an important part. So it's an important one. So yeah, that's another one. The Alamo. I mean, sure, any of you exposed to American culture know what I'm talking about. Like literally, the saying is "Remember the Alamo." Like literally, remember this defeat of the Texans, who are outclassed, outgunned, and just wiped out. And yes, of course, the war changes after that. Texas gets its independence, but then immediately joins the United States. Anyway, so it's taken on a much bigger thing. It's a foundational myth of Texas, part of the United States, relations with Mexico, expansion into the West, which just comes after. I mean, this is all this connectedness, but it's still marked as this defeat. Staying on the American trend a little bit here is another small one that most people don't remember or do know and just forget about it, is the Spanish-American War, right? Another defeat, so to speak, right, at the beginning with the sinking of the Maine in Havana, in Cuba, and blaming the Spaniards on it for its thinking, even though they think it was a boiler explosion. Even at the time, they thought it was a boiler explosion, but it was a cause belli for war. And it's this, remember the Maine, like there's all this propaganda. And then that leads into the First World War as well, because you use these national myths. All of that connects to it. But the next one that I want to talk about, and this has already been brought up by the History Underground, is Pearl Harbor. Sorry, 1 second here. It's an interesting one, right? It's a defeat. Defeat. Right? The Pacific Fleet is sent to the bottom. Get chunk of it. The battleships are decimated. Sorry, again, I probably shouldn't use that word because people jump on people who use that word. Utterly destroyed. Yes, the carriers are not there, and that's what matters later. That's an important one. It's an important one in that sense, right? Because the aircraft carriers make the difference in the Pacific War, not the battleships. It's the aircraft carriers. They're out at the time doing repairs, maneuvers, training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a defeat, though, right? You think of defeat when you think of Pearl Harbor? Let me know in the sidebar or down below if you're watching this later. Have you ever thought of Pearl Harbor as a defeat in that sense, right? It's a loss. The Americans lose that battle. They lose it. Yes, it's a sneak attack. No causes, no declaration of war. The Japan kind of fumbled that one. Big. Yeah, and sorry, guys, I do want to talk about Gallipoli, but I want to use that to bring it around later. Yeah, and the submarines. Yeah, you're right, Scott. Sorry about that. Submarines and the aircraft carriers is what makes the difference in the Pacific. Anyway, but yeah, leave comments. Have you ever thought about it as a defeat? Because it's an interesting one to me, because like I said, I studied it quite a bit. I argue that it's that attack that brings Hawaii into the United States as a state, right? There was no talk of this before Pearl Harbor. Little rumblings, but nothing with any real power behind it. And then it does happen. It does occur. These things do happen. But it's connected to victory, this ultimate, American triumphantness. We come into the war now, we're united behind this because there's so much division. And, in the United States with the America First Committee and the non-interventionists and all of that, it's this uniting factor that brings America together for this great, the good war, this great crusade, and all of that, all this language that's used about it. So I don't think it's seen as a defeat. It's not in that sense, I don't think. Yeah, I think. Sorry. Okay, one thing here. Yeah, we'll get to Singapore, Alex, in a second. But I don't think there's a difference. Maybe I'm just saying them lost. Yeah, no, actually, Norm, that's a really good point. What is the difference? Leave your thoughts. Let me know. I mean, a defeat is possibly a battle that you almost enter in willingly. The loss is like a wipeout. I know we see a mention here from Alex about the Prince of Wales and repulse, Z-Force, that sort of thing. That's a loss. Is that a defeat? I don't know. It's both, I guess. I don't know. I don't really know if that's an interesting topic in and of itself, I think, and let me know. I'm not really sure what to say. but there's that element to it, right? There's this defeat, but it's instantly. I mean, it's that day that this sort of united, we're now going to get the Japanese back for this is coming. You know, it happens instantly. It's a defeat. It's a loss. It's whatever you want to call it. Good chunk of the Pacific Fleet is wiped out. People are worried about an invasion of the U.S. West Coast right away. Like they think the Japanese have carrier groups just waiting to attack. Right? It causes panic. And all of these stuff that leads to this, and to Americans doing all kinds of wrong, crazy things, like interning people of Japanese ancestry who live in the United States for generations. We follow suit in Canada. It leads to this panic that it didn't need to happen. I mean, Pearl Harbor wasn't crazy enough of itself, and they think this is going to be, it's going to be repeated, apparently. It's just how that goes in that sense. So I think that's an interesting one. And then you have the other major Pacific defeat, Pacific Indian Ocean, and they're connected because it's lost to Japan, is Singapore. That's been talked about in the sidebar. It's a big one. It's not the same as Pearl Harbor, obviously, and it's got more connections to events in the past than I would say Pearl Harbor does, because Gallipoli was mentioned, and that's one I do want to talk about. It's this foundational myth. Sorry, Gallipoli is. And again, sorry if there's Australians, New Zealanders, or other people watching. If I get something wrong, I apologize. But again, this is just what I've kind of noticed and done after years of work. Sorry, it's this foundational myth of the Anzacs, right? At Gallipoli, that digger spirit, right? That self-sacrifice where we come together as a nation to fight back, to continue this, building together this unity, this, I believe, brotherhood at the time, and all of that sort of spirit. And it's used to that end, right? It's still, it's a complicated one. We don't really have an equivalent in Canada. Maybe Beaumont Hamel, maybe, but that's a Newfoundland thing. It's different, it's complicated. Anyway, so yeah, I just want to touch on Gallipoli in that sense, and I want to come back around. But it's connected to, and then Australian identity, New Zealand identity. It's connected though with Singapore, because here comes another defeat. Not as spectacular, really, because Gallipoli is kind of like a slow deflating balloon, where Singapore, the whole thing just blows, right? If you want to use a metaphor. But the losses at Singapore, huge for the British Empire, for the Australians, for the Indians. There's just huge losses. So many POWs defeated by, they're outnumbering this force by a lot, get outmaneuvered, where almost maneuver is nearly impossible, and get quickly defeated. You can go on and on about that all day long, which is why I wanted to do a stream like this, because we just talk about, why did they get defeated? What happened? Who did what? Who didn't do what? What should have they done? A bit of an armchair generalship. And that's not really what I wanted to talk about today. Is more just understanding it, what it means at the time, and kind of moving forward. So there's that part of, Singapore. It's focused on way more than, say, Hong Kong, which comes first, obviously. And I'm not comparing the two based on scale. It's more of a timing thing, because Hong Kong falls first. It's the first big one to fall for the British Empire. Falls well before Singapore or Philippines or, the Dutch East Indies. All of that is the first one to go. And, it's a shock at the time, and then the shocks just keep coming, right? So Singapore is a big one. People say that's where the British Empire dies. It's not really what I'm here to talk about, but it's an interesting point to consider. It's a spectacular defeat. It's no bones about it. It shouldn't have happened that way, but it did, and it's occupied this place ever since. Right, about how Singapore and everything that's gone with that, and British history and military policy and all of this. But again, as part of Australian lore, New Zealander lore. Sorry, just the Australians, not the New Zealanders. But again, sorry, that's a bit of a tangent, but it'll come together at the end here, I promise, because there's a bigger theme I want to talk about. But it's one that can't be missed. Now, the one that might be a little bit controversial. Actually, sorry, I'll do another run of questions here, because I think I might have missed. So sorry, Great Dominion. I got the Gallipoli mentioned there. Sorry. And then this is a bit of an aside, but tragic self-sacrifice makes a better narrative. It undoubtedly does. especially on the personal level, right? Or small groups. Going back to Tennyson, rode the 600, right? People know what that means. Ours is not to question why, ours is to do or die. Yeah, it makes great stories. It gets people's attention. Heroic sacrifice, particularly in the late Victorian era, moving into the First World War, which kind of changes that a little bit. It's an interesting one. Yeah, and I want to wrap this up by coming back to your question, or sorry, your comment, Sheldrake, about Dieppe, and you too, Norma. That's a good one. And yeah, I talked a little bit about Beaumont and Mel and where that fits in, but we'll come back around, I think, to that. But yeah, good comments about Pearl Harbor. There's a mention of Wake Island. I think me and the Great Dominion have discussed this on Twitter before, and not in a mean way. Yeah, it has power at the time. Yeah, it does, but I hardly any today. You mentioned Wake. No one has any idea what you're talking about. People don't even know what Wake Island is. People in the know. I say that a lot because it's true, right? If you know, you know. If you don't know, you have no idea what that means. It's this tiny little island that no one has any idea about. It may have power within the U.S. military or those who study it. The general population doesn't know what Wake Island is. And I don't think that's necessarily, it is what it is, right? I'm not commenting on whether it should be or not. It's not. Yes, there's movies at the time. It's got some propaganda elements. Yes. It is, but it doesn't have the staying power that Pearl Harbor does, right? And it never will. It's just, this is how these things go. This is all, again, my opinion. I could be wrong, but Romaine, good point. Coming back again to Pearl Harbor. Can you say it was defeated when you're not supposed to be fighting? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. We call the defeat with the Russians at Port Arthur in 1904, when the Japanese did the exact same thing. We call that a defeat. Ponder that one, I guess. I don't have an answer, but I mean, I've never seen it not described as a defeat. People applauded it at the time, saying it was innovative. It was the way they should have done it. It's quickly how things change, right? Sorry, I'm just reading Norma's comment here. It's a good one. I don't know. What do you think, everybody? I think it's an interesting one. I think I think that is part of it, and I want to get to that. But I think it's a good point just to keep in mind about this and what that could mean. It's something to ponder, definitely something to ponder. But yeah, it's a very interesting one in that sense. Yeah, and yeah, I did want to talk about this just very briefly, but kind of got lost in the shuffle. Sorry, I keep reading different ones. The British viewpoint, particularly the Second World War, kind of coming back to that because I want to get to another big British one in a second. But Dunkirk, Blitz, Dunkirk is a defeat, wholeheartedly a defeat, complete defeat and destruction and retreat. It's not viewed that way at the time, not even close, right? It's rallying cry. It's, remember Dunkirk. We have to fight back because of Dunkirk, right? We pulled this out of the jaws of defeat. We did this. We did a good thing. Yeah, it was a good thing, but it was a defeat. And it hasn't changed that much, I think, in a lot of ways. In that viewpoint, right? The movie doesn't help. This whole Blitz spirit that's made its comeback, I'd argue in a lot of ways, and this isn't my opinion only, this Blitz spirit that's come up because of Brexit and all of this. It's a weird thing that I don't know too much about, so you can leave your thoughts on that as well on sidebar or afterwards down below. This kind of British view of defeat. I'm talking like this is a pure British thing, right? Yes, I know it wasn't just the BEF extracted at Dunkirk. I'm very aware of that, but how it's been used as this mythology is extremely British, I think, in my opinion. Anyway, so that's a really, really interesting one. And yeah, great point from the Great Dominion here. I want to use that as kind of to wrap it up when I come back. Yeah, anyway, sorry, I'm just reading about. Okay, so what I was going to say and got sidetracked there. And this one might be a controversial one because of how it's viewed and all of that goes on with it. And it's already been mentioned in the sidebar and a bit of chatter online about before I did any of this, is Operation Market Garden. It's going to be controversial. People have all kinds of opinions about it. I just wanted to mention it because it's connected to what I wanted to talk about and the Second World War and all of that. And it's come up recently again in popular memory as a term that's, I know, complicated, but it's what I use, is this massive defeat. There's no way to put it, right? It's a huge defeat. It's this war-winning offensive that's going to use this new and fancy technology and this new innovative tactic, which wasn't really new or innovative by this point, of the airborne to outflank and outmaneuver the Germans. They didn't know there was an SS division in the area of Arnhem, and it's a spectacular loss, right? Bridge too far. You can't deny the impact that that book and therefore that movie have had on the understanding of the Second World War. Huge impact. And there's misunderstandings about what the movie makers were trying to do with that movie. And it's complicated, and I suggest you look into that. I'm no expert on it by any means, but I think it's an interesting one. And here comes the conversations I wanted to see. Market Garden, is it a failure? Is it a defeat? Yeah, I mean, the first Airborne is defeated, I think, and in Arnhem. Yes, the 2 bridges are taken. Did they do as much good? I don't know. You take half your, or their famous quote, right? It's 90% successful. I don't know. I this is one that there might be some hate in the comments later, but it's interesting. I don't know. I just wanted to kind of throw it out there and look at it about how it fits in, right? It's a failure and it's an overall objective, right? The war has not ended swiftly. There's this huge, and this part's not really talked about much. There's this salient that's driven into the German lines that the Canadians end up filling. The First Canadian Army, which is interesting, taking over from the airborne divisions that land there, particularly the 101st and the 82nd, the American divisions. It's an interesting one. I don't know. I think it's a defeat. Honestly, I do. Yeah, I mean, Alex is right. What I was just saying, right? The salient. It's not the way it was supposed to go. Literally directionally, it was not supposed to go. Big picture. I don't know, Alex. Yeah, I think. Well, yeah. I mean, this is not how it's really talked about, and I think you guys are making some really interesting points here. I mean, yeah, we got a salient. Whoop-de-doo. What good did it do us, right? It doesn't really get, do any good at all. They don't really take it until much later and secure it. And it takes forever, and it takes a huge effort yet again, right? With Operation Veritable. Look into it if you're not too sure. It's another fascinating one. So this is cleared, right? It's a mess. Literally, it's this muddy mess. It's this low-lying territory. It's brutal, and we don't talk about it. But this is why it happens, because of Market Garden. This I say again, a defeat. They were defeated. Yeah, they took 2 bridges, and the 101st and the 82nd did fairly well. There's issues with the armor. Again, not a Market Garden expert, but I like throwing wrenches into things, and I think this is a good wrench to throw, right? We talk about defeat, what it means. Yeah, and this is what it's another one that I think is an interesting case study. There's the word I'm looking for, because this is something I think is good in a sense. Yes, the heroism, the good feats that happen, learning from the mistakes is important. It's always important. I as someone who looks at defeat and why I'm doing a live stream like this, it's something I think about. I think the kids would like that. Maybe not, because I think most of them are orphans. But yes, good Christmas parties for the kids and I make. And there's pictures, and it's talked about a lot in Canadian history. You can find pictures of it online from the Library and Archives website. It's right there. And they did Hanukkah parties too, I believe. Yes, they did, with the U.S. Airborne still in the area, which is really, really cool. Now that it being Hanukkah now, those are some really cool photos. Seeing this inter-allied Christmas. Pardon my apologies. Hanukkah party with Canadian and Jewish. Canadian and American Jewish soldiers having a Hanukkah party. I think it's fascinating. It's great. I think it's great. So yeah. Anyway, yeah. There's that. But again, there's these questions about Market Garden, what it does, and sorry, Norma, I know it's just going to upset you, but what it does for the Shelled, which we've covered on the channel multiple times, and what that means for the Shelled, the use of resources, where they should have been focused. Bomber Command could have done other things. They could have been helping with that. They could have focused an airborne division on the Sheld, which was part of the plan. That never happened. Would it have worked? I don't know. Maybe not. Can't say for sure because it's a what if. Anyway, so there's that part of it, which is its own crazy part. The Sheld is connected to it. And also, when I was going to say at the beginning here of why it's back into popular conversation is the Forgotten Battle. Did a live stream about that, talked about that a little bit. Yeah, sorry, going back here a little bit because this is an amazing comment. The Royal Canadian Engineers got their time to shine from Market Garden rescuing. Excuse me, sorry, the a good number of the 1st Airborne out of the other side, right? It's famously shown in Band of Brothers, other mentions of it. But yeah, it's a good point. I mean, that's the Canadian mention in Band of Brothers, which is obviously one of the biggest impacts on understanding of the Second World War into the 21st century, right? Literally after 9/11 debuts, I think that day before, something crazy like that. It's how we. Okay. Anyway, sorry. These are great comments, so I'm gonna come back to them. It's interesting. It's interesting. Yeah. Hey, be nice, everybody. Don't fight. But I know it's a good point. Anyway, sorry. The Forgotten Battle. I want to get on that. Market Gardens included. Why? It has nothing to do with the Sheld in that sense, right? If you want to do a movie and then literally call it the Forgotten Battle, and it's supposed to be about the Sheld, why is Market Garden included for that much? Why do we need a character connecting Market Garden to the Sheld when they're not connected in that sense, right? They're connected, but not that way. It's a weird thing. I think it's just done for sales purposes, right? Again, why we're talking about Market Garden. It's popular. People like talking about it. All that stuff. It's because I think that's what it was to draw people in, right? People love the kit, the airborne, the dash, the bravery, the jumping of planes, the gliders. Everyone loves that stuff, right? It's why I think it's included. And Alex makes an excellent point, right? It's still forgotten after the film, and I agree. It's not even a third of the film. So, and they could have done it, and they didn't. I mean, they do the Causeway really badly, but they do the Causeway, the Weltrin Causeway. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that to any of our Dutch friends out there. My Dutch is non-existent. I apologize. But anyway, so that's a big one. Market Garden, I don't want to prattle on about it too much because it's got enough ink and probably even blood spilled over it in pubs, etc. I'm sure that's happened. This is a really interesting point from Scott. And I get what you're saying, Scott, and I'm just going to disagree respectfully so, because I'm a big fan of Scott, who helps me a lot and has great opinions. But this one, I just don't see them the same, in a sense. Maybe. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about. I think this is why I wanted to do this. I wanted to get ththings I had never thought about out of this. So thanks, Scott, for that. That's something to I'm disagreeing just off the hop, kind of my understanding and background and everything. I don't think it's quite the same, but I get what you're saying, right? It's the same idea: a salient driven into the enemy lines, a failure at its initial objectives, and then ultimately succeeds from some major changes. Yeah, maybe that's a way, but I'm just saying I don't think Market Garden's viewed like that at all, right? It seemed to have this supposed impact on the the conduct of the war and all of this and everything that goes with Market Garden and this learning element, which I'll come back to in a second, or sorry, in a bit here, because of the Canadian thing, how I want to wrap this all up and all of this, but still getting in your point. So I think that's a great one to talk about and a way to think about it. And yeah, I think it's great to think about it that way. In that sense, and I don't know enough about the nitty gritty of Anzio to say what, but just off the top of the head, with everything, it's an interesting one. So anyway, sorry, I'm just going to go through this real quick, and this is an interesting point too that I didn't want to skip over. Is from the Great Dominion about wanting another airborne drop. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the historiography. That's part of the arguments. That's part of what happens. The documents show these kinds of things. It's an interesting one. Yeah, I mean, they want to use like I said, this new shiny toy that that is something I didn't talk about before, that the Germans had abandoned in 1941, right after Crete, when they were wiped out more or less, and they never do an airborne drop again in combat. So this is interesting. I mean, the Allies keep doing it. Should they have? There's a few successful ones, obviously, right? Normandy. But also the big one, right, that doesn't get talked about enough, and probably should, is Varsity. Operation Varsity is a big one. That's a big one. So I think that's it's an interesting, yeah. Right. And Scott, you're right. Sorry, coming back, Scott. You're right. It didn't achieve its objectives. So was Anzio. You're right. So you guys are changing my opinions. That's a big one. Hargut Forest, yeah. Yeah, these are really interesting questions, and that's why I want to do it. I don't really have answers per se, but I did want to kind of to bring that up. It's a way of thinking about these things, right? I wanted to wrap this around a Canadian because I know the context the best. That's why I wanted to do it. But this is a great way to think about it, Romain. That's another way. You and Scott seem to be on the same page here. These ultimate objectives are failed to reach. Some are successful, some are not. It's just why I love doing this, because we get to talk about it and try to wrap our heads around different things and different perspectives and from different places. Romain, in France. Sorry if you don't want me to say that, Romain, but I think people know that. Great tour guide in France. I hope to get to visit you soon. It's a great way to think about it. Yeah, Husky's now coming up. Alex is getting his Operation Husky mentioned in there, like he's got to do. Just kidding, Alex. Just kidding. I like talking about it too. It's a good one to talk about, and it gets forgotten in the shuffle, which is another thing I like to do, right? Especially with shows like this, is talk about different things. So again, yeah, I think that's an important one. It's to think about it this way. Hopefully, sorry if I missed anything else. If you guys had something you really want me to talk about or bring up, please post it again. If I missed it, I'm sorry. You guys are this is great. You guys are doing. This is great stuff. I love this. It's great stuff. So, sorry, yeah, real quick, I do want to do my customary shout out to my patrons. Please, if you like what I'm doing, please do support me, even a little bit, a couple bucks a month, a few quid here and there, so a euro or two is helpful. So if you can, please do. It helps me continue doing work and let me do things like this. So if you do want to help, that would be fantastic. Yeah, so I think it's a really, really interesting way of thinking about this. It's a good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, lots of great stuff's coming up. It's tons coming up here that I haven't thought about, which is what I wanted. We're getting over the hour mark. Unless you guys want me to keep going, I have no plans otherwise. But one thing I did want to wrap up, or kind of provide an end point, I guess, is talking about the Canadian context, because I know it the best, obviously, and I want to use an example. And why I wanted to come back to things like Gallipoli and all of that is the First World War. And more specifically, and I think we're already on this track anyway, which is great, is the Battle of Second Ypres, right? For those of you who don't know, who are not Canadians, because we tend to focus on this one a lot more than other people do, it is the first major use of asphyxiating gas, particularly on the Western Front. Canadians, it has this mythos that we're the ones who plugged the line, stopped the German advance from basically overrunning the salient in Ypres, and whatever that would have entailed. We give all kinds of crap to the French troops that were involved, the Algerian elements of the colonial divisions. We give them crap for breaking and running. We talk about this Canadian dash and cunning and informative nature of, again, apologize, it's gross, but, the urinating on the handkerchiefs to use as a very ad hoc respirator because of I think it's the phosphorus in the urine or something. I can't remember. I'm not a chemist. Interacts with the gas and makes it less deadly. I don't know. Anyway, it's not seen as a defeat because that's not Canada's First World War. All right, bye, Norman. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. It's not seen as a defeat, right? Canada's First World War is not seen as a defeat, and Alex mentioned this way back. Is this sort of victory of the Canadian Corps, victory after victory after victory, right? Is Second Ypres a victory? Not even close. Is it a defeat? I think so. A huge number of casualties. The lines pulled back. The situation's made more difficult. The salient is still in place, yes, but it leads to more brutal, bloody fighting that defined the Ypres salient. Lens, yes. We did a show on Lens, Alex. Go watch that one. We did talk about that one at length, but you're right. Lens is another part of this. It's another thing. It's another defeat, I argue. Another one of those. We didn't take all our objectives. Is that a defeat? Can you have a defeat within a victory? There's the question. Can you have defeat within victory? Maybe that's a good way of putting this. Can you do that? Yeah, this is another great point, Scott, and something else that what I just asked is, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Guadalcanal is a perfect example of this, and something that we don't think about in that way. Again, I say we, I mean just this general collective mass that is humanity. Talking about this that's what it is. Yeah, sorry. There's the naval defeats, the naval, the U.S. Navy pulling back, basically, banning the Marines for a short period of time or a long period of time, depending on where you're involved. Yes, Alex brain explode. I know my brain's exploding too, and that's what I wanted to happen today. I can have that happen on Saturdays when I don't have as much to do, which is great. But yeah, I think it's an interesting way. I think Second Eep is a good way to think about it, right? Is what defines defeat? What does defeat mean? How do you go about even understanding defeat, right? There's defeats within victories, like that has just been said. Barrier Ridge, which I did mention. Yes, sorry, it's been an hour. I forgot. I did mention, right? The defeat within victory. That's part of this. It is. I mean, yeah, Operation Spring is a failure in that sense. But other things happen, right? And then there's this whole argument about what the strategy is and how it's carried out and all that fun stuff and everything. So that's a big one. That's a big one that cannot be forgotten. Sorry. And that, I think these are really good questions, something for everybody to kind of ponder. And I did want to leave with that Canadian example of Second Eep, because it doesn't have the power of Vimy, not even close victory. Vimy is a victory, undoubtedly so. But and this is another way of maybe thinking about it. And it's something that people have been trying to argue, but get kind of drowned out within all the drum beating, is Vimy is a victory within a major defeat. Major defeat, right? The Ross offensive, I'm sorry again for the pronunciations, fails spectacularly. It doesn't work, right? This is why there's this whole argument about Vimy Ridge and its lack of importance, right? The position itself is not that important because Ross fails. It's important later, but that doesn't become clear until later, right? With the spring offensives in 1918, the Germans don't attack that chunk of the BEF, right? As they saw Canadians, Brits, Australians, is all the same. So that part of the line is not attacked because, like I've said, I think I said this the other day on Twitter, no matter which way you're attacking this ridge, you're not going to have a good time. But particularly from the German lines, as they had been established afterwards, it's going to be a bloody massacre. So they just didn't bother, I think. Again, I don't know the documents and I don't read German, so there's that part of it. But it's definitely certainly something to think about in that sense too, right? And how we view war and defeat and victory and identity, which is something I always talk about. Sorry. Okay. I get Romain makes a very good point. And yeah, if you guys have questions or stuff you want to talk about, please do it now, because that's basically what I wanted to say is for the Canadians watching and for the non-Canadians is trying to wrap this all together and how I think about it, the Canadian examples, but the things I can't separate out, right? I can't stop thinking about things like the Alamo, the Light Brigade, Thermopylae, Gallipoli. And oh yeah, this is the other point I wanted to make. So yeah, if you do have more questions or comments that you want to talk about, please fire away. Again, I'm not going anywhere. So if you guys want to keep talking, I'm game, because I will talk all day, as some of you know, is the First World War, right? I think it's an important part of Australia, New Zealand, Canada. I think that's a huge part of this, right? Where do these defeats happen? What do they lead to? What war are they part of? What conflict are they part of? What do they do in the long run, right? How do we view them now as opposed to at the time? Like, these are all part of this. And I think it's a great way to look at it and to think about it. And thanks for everyone who brought up Gallipoli and all of that and the way of thinking about it. It's an interesting one. And people have mentioned Vimy as the foundational myth. It is, but it shouldn't be, because that's all wrong. It's not. Canada's not a nation on the slopes of Vimy Ridge. That's not what happened. That doesn't happen until 50 years later, and they start making these claims that have no support anywhere. which is interesting in and of itself. But I think in the Canadian context, and this is different than, say, the United States, is the First World War and the impact that has on our understanding of loss, defeat, victory, sacrifice, everything, right? And all of that is changed is a great way of doing so. I think it's a great way to look at it. And another example that just pops in my head, I think it was mentioned earlier, is sorry, Michael, I'll come back to your comment again because I have something for that too. But the Somme, right? Massacre on the first day. There's no other way to put it. The kind of thing, my camera's going all crazy on me. Sorry, guys. I need to get a better one. I need to put some money away for that. I don't have it yet, unfortunately, to get a better camera set up for these things. I apologize. Sorry, what was I saying? Oh, yeah, the Somme, right? It's a attritional battle. It's how we understand that one. Those views are changing, seen as a pointless slaughter by a lot of people, all of that stuff. Is it a victory? They didn't, gain their objectives until much later, but at a huge cost, right? It's still mentioned the Somme, and it's painful for people. So many losses on the Somme, right? You can just say the Somme, and those who know what you're talking about know what they're talking about, right? They know what that means, that have been there, who have had family members die there, the great losses, the unknown soldiers, that the Thiepval Memorial, and how big that is with all the names on it. It's just I think it's this big package that we are understanding, but we don't focus enough on what all of these great parts. Sorry, I just read Angela's comments, so I threw it in great for no reason. All these big parts that come together, it's this big puzzle that we are allowing ourselves not to put together because we get stuck up on things, and that's what different people like to do, and they want to talk about the more technical elements of it and all of that and objective and anything. But it's just, I think we need to think about defeat differently, I guess, is probably my other big theme of the day, right? What that means, how we view it today, how views of defeats change, what becomes a defeat, what becomes a victory, right? Second Eep is all over the place. I think it changes multiple times, right? About, defeat, victory, massacre, whatever. It's kind of all over the place. And that's kind of why I wanted to use that one as kind of a closing example, or ending my sort of thoughts on this. Again, if anyone has any more, that one's a really, really interesting one. And sorry, yeah, Michael had a really good point here. They lose every battle except the ones that counts. Maybe it's true for all of us. I think another way of putting it, and I use this in the dissertation, and I didn't get any flack for it, so it must have been good, is JFK famously said it in the more recent example after the failure at Bay of Pigs in Cuba, is defeat is an orphan. Sorry, victory has many fathers, defeat is an orphan. That to me is a big part of this in the Canadian context. Again, I don't know the other ones as well. And this is going to be more, maybe another controversial part of this that I forgot to talk about. But with our defeats, and I'm looking at my list here, Dieppe, Hong Kong, Barrier Ridge, not so much Barrier Ridge, but definitely Dieppe and Hong Kong, the two big ones. We blame somebody else. It's not Canada's fault, or it's some Canadian leader who's gone rogue on us and is using us as cannon fodder for their own goals. It's never something that we did wrong. It's never something that didn't go where it could. There's always something there. Dieppe is the perfect example of that. It's an interesting one. Again, I mentioned the changes in the historiography and the evidence and everything can change that. But at the time, even right now, because there's still some smoking guns missing, I'll say that out loud now. And that's my opinion. Again, this is just my opinion. It's somebody else screwed Canadians. Somebody else did this. Somebody else made a mistake. That happens in Canadian all the time. It happens in Australian. Again, I used a great text from the Australians who put together about their myths. It's a great book that we need in Canada. Like, they literally had 10 or so myths about Australian military history, and they just tried to debunk them. We don't have that in Canada. I think we should. That would be a great book to have and to do, because we need to do that. And we do it in dribs and drabs and things like this, but it's not going to make an impact until we make, a collective effort to try to do that. Anyway, so sorry. Yeah. So they talk about that too, in terms of the South African War, Boer War, as it's also known, about, the Brits weren't letting us do the way we could have done. We could have won better or whatever. It's present there with the story of Breaker Mormont. If you don't know that story, look it up. It's crazy. This guy was all over the map. Yeah, it's a good one. But again, sorry, going back, and Romaine has said it perfectly, but it's true. We have to find someone to blame. Yeah, I mean, we need to blame somebody. We don't put this on our own shoulders. I mean, Hong Kong is literally Canadians. We could have said no. People keep saying we could not have said no. Maybe I'm jumping on my own material here, but for the next live stream that I'll be doing this coming week, they could have said no. Yes, they could have. They had said no before. They had said no after. Why did they have to say yes? You can't say that they had to say yes. That's not true. They could have said no, but they didn't. So that's why I like to understand it in that sense. It's not a focus on defeat for me. It's trying to understand the mindset of what happened, why these things happen the way they happen. And it's not about, I want to further talking about defeats and only focusing on defeats, because I think people who are watching and know me know that's not true, because I do everything else. And I think we should focus on the good parts and, kind of build up what Canada did in a good way. And maybe this is a controversial thing to say for Canadians, because we're always got this nicety about us. We don't toot our own horn, or we're polite and all this stuff, which if you drive in Canada, it's not true. Anyway, it's this, our downplaying of our own victories. And I think that's a mistake. And I don't think it's just because of, drum beating and, we need a Canadian G.I. Joe. It's not because of that. It's because of how we misunderstand ourselves, what we do with our military, how we understand ourselves on the world stage. I think this has real world current ramifications that are causing problems. It's something that we need to think about and how we go about it. And this is like a cry to Canadians or other people as well, international people, and going on here. And it's something we need to think about. And this is a really good point from Great Dominion that I'm just thinking about. Coming back to the discussion we had about, what's going on in the East Coast of Canada and 42. And Mark Milner talked about that on the We Have Ways pod this week previously, which was a great one. Listen to it. I highly suggest it. It was great. Mark Milner is a great historian, great presenter. But anyway, trying to change the perceptions of what that means and the situation the Royal Canadian Navy was in. This is a perfect example of what I wanted to say, kind of as another point that I forgot. And something that is so missed all the time, unfortunately, is the enemy's actions. I think Norma said earlier something about the classic idiom of no plan survives contact with the enemy. But I think in a lot of ways, we leave out the agency of the enemy in that sense, particularly with things in the Far East, right? That has got racist connotations to it. I'll just say that outright because I've seen the letters, the way they were talking to each other about the Japanese soldiers, the way they're talking about even the Chinese that were on their side. It's got to have an explanation because of racism, that the Japanese couldn't defeat us. We're this mighty race of people, which is not even close to the truth. It's just that in a lot of cases, the Japanese were just better. They outgunned us, outmaneuvered us, outdid everything us, and we are still trying to present it as this great thing that someone else did to us, but not the Japanese. And this happens in other places too, other conflicts, other defeats. Sometimes we just are not good. And I'm talking about we in Canadian, but it also happens other places. Wake comes up again. Yeah, outnumbered. Still didn't fight well. It's just how that went. Yeah, this happens in the Philippines. Mistakes are made. Things go bad. That's war. That's conflict. That's something that I think gets forgotten. Sometimes the enemy just is better than you. And there's no explanation for it other than they're just better. And you lost because you weren't good. I know that can be controversial. That's a tough one for some people to take, right? Sometimes we're just not good. Canadian Army is not good sometimes. The British Army is not good sometimes. I'm going to get jumped on. The U.S. Army is not good sometimes, right? And here comes the most Canadian of Canadian examples. For those of you, I'm not sure which one Alex is talking about because it's happened more than once. But this, woohoo, I'm a Montreal fan, so I love this. But I dislike both teams equally. Do the Leafs, the Leafs have lost famously in the first round of the playoffs. I don't know how many times now in a row. It's a lot. Did the Leafs beat themselves or did the Boston beat them? Toronto fans, it's always Toronto made the mistake. Maybe this is why. Maybe I'm getting half joking here, but hockey fans, right? It's always their own fault. It wasn't just because the other team was better, right? We need to fix us. Yeah, stay away from Montreal. I'll just block you from the stream, Alex. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Don't even be disparaging my Habs. I know how terrible they are right now. I'm fully aware. Don't need to be reminded. Anyway, the Leafs. Yes. So sorry, that's just a way of thinking about it, right? Did the other team just do better? Did we just get outplayed tonight? Did we just get beaten on the battlefield? That happens. And we really sometimes... this goes on, and there's all kinds of elements here, and yeah, and Great Dominion makes another great point. Sometimes the conditions against you, and you can't overcome them regardless of what's happening. That happens, right? That's how this happens. You can, and I've used this example to non-military people who are interested in history and don't really understand it. My own fiance likes history, but not this type of history. So I explained to her, kind of thinking about it, right? You could be the best martial artist on the planet and know everything about this. But if you're outnumbered by a couple of guys with some knives and there's 10 of them and they've got a little bit of training, they can still defeat you, right? You can still lose. It's just, this is how these things tend to go sometimes. There's nothing you can do. You're put in a position that there's nothing you can do. You can try your best. You should learn from defeats. I'm not arguing that. That is what I've also been accused of saying we should just sweep it in the bin. I never said that. I've never said that. I never will say that. You have to look at them. You have to look at the defeats along with the victories. You have to do them lockstep. You can't do one or the other. You have to do both. Canada, I would argue in the Second World War, a lot just focuses on the defeats or the nasty things that Canada did. Again, not saying they shouldn't be talked about. Tim Cook makes the same point with things like interning Canadians of Japanese ancestry, the civil rights issues that also happened. And then I think even with certain individuals, they were justified in the things that these people were doing, but they're used, and Quebec especially, that's another aside, in the Second World War, sorry. It's just, we need to look at the nasty with the good. We need to look at them together. You can't do one or the other if you're trying to understand a bigger thing like a world war or Canadian identity or Canadian decision making, because these defeats still have an impact. And again, I didn't really want to talk about this, and I'm not sure how it's going to go, but this is, again, just my thinking out loud almost with you guys who are great supporters of mine. It's something that I hope is not true. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid I won't be. And I know some people here listening right now fought there, and again, you've done way more self-sacrifice than I could ever do. I'm just concerned. This is a concern I do have about Afghanistan and how that will be viewed in Canada specifically coming up in the next couple of years, decades. I don't know. My thought is we're just going to start blaming somebody else again. It was the British. Sorry, not the British. There's a Freudian World War II slip for you. The Americans made us go. We just did it because the Americans said so, or we did it. It was an American idea. It wasn't our idea. The Canadian people got killed. I'm sorry again for those watching who may have had friends, unit members killed. I'm not trying to belittle their struggle or their losses, because I don't believe that. I honestly do not believe it. It's just, I'm scared of that's what's going to happen, because this is how we think of things here in Canada specifically. This is still happening. And again, maybe this is the point that I can stop talking. It's still got impacts, and it still affects us and how we think. And I'm scared that that's what's going to happen with Afghanistan. And again, those who know me, I'm not a beat the drum, play the fife, wave the flag kind of guy. I'm not. People know me kind of cynical and down to earth in those ways kind of things, and like to look at all angles. But it's just something I'm scared is going to happen. It's going to cloud the debate of what happened, because that's not what happened, right? Yeah, Article 5 was enacted under NATO. I know that. I get that. And then this is going to happen, and there's misunderstandings of what that article even means and what NATO even means. But that's something in the future I think we should be on the lookout for, is how defeat in different contexts, right? Because in the United States, it's no different in terms of Afghanistan, add Iraq in there. Again, I'm no expert. I don't live in the United States. I've spent a lot of time there, and I know a lot of Americans and talk to a lot of Americans of different stripes and know people from different parts of the country. But these are the same sort of things I'm thinking about, of how these things are going to be viewed, right? It's just an interesting topic. It has an impact on people today, people who have fought and died, where people go and fight and die. Again, this is getting more out of the history realm, but it's a thing. It's a thing that I think is interesting and something to keep in mind moving forward. So that's definitely something I did want to mention, is what I think that this impact on the future can be. So yeah, so thanks everyone for watching. A few things, there's a few questions here that I missed, or some good points that I just want to wrap up real quick. And this is right, because I've read this myself. William Philpott's book, I think it's back behind me somewhere. The narratives of the Somme don't talk about the Germans. It's these ghostly figures behind the hill firing the machine guns. That's what happened. And they just were better prepared because they had so much time and so much thought to put into it, when the Somme offensive was not planned as long and not thought out as well as the Germans had done. And again, sometimes they're just better. Again, I'm not one to go on about defeat in that sense, but sometimes you just aren't good. Sometimes it's just not your night. But in the war, the outcomes are brutal and lead to real important things. And I think this is why I wanted to talk about this too, is the importance of this and what that means. Because some people argue history has no impact on today. And I think this is a perfect case of where that's not the truth. And again, I guess I'll leave it there. It's been an hour and a half. I still have lots of people watching. So thank you. Thanks everyone for watching. If you like this channel, please subscribe. If you're a new viewer, please do. I'm trying to hit that 1,000 mark at the current time. I'm not sure what I'm at right now. I forget, but I'm very close, under 50 to go. Please subscribe. It does a great deal of help for me. Leaving comments after the fact as well is very helpful, because that's how the algorithm picks up on videos and channels. Sorry, also liking the video is very, very helpful. So please do so if you enjoyed this and want to see more. Coming up on, what day of the week is that? I should probably have remembered this. 4 days time, which would make it Wednesday, the 8th. I'll be doing my Hong Kong AMA. You can send me questions ahead of time on social media, or leave questions in the comments of the Hong Kong video as well, because then I will look at them. I will include them. I might just do a run of the pre-questions, first. I'm not sure, depending on how many I get. I've already got some, or some things people want me to talk about, which I will do. Hong Kong is my dissertation topic. It's the thing I think I'm an expert on. I don't like saying that out loud, but I think it's true. I spent a lot of time on it and a lot of thought on it. So that one's going to be an important one. Again, if you can't make it live, send me questions and I'll get to them. You can watch it later. I'm sure there's going to be lots of discussions around it that day because of that. And I'm looking forward to talking about it in that sense. You can talk about defeat again. We'll do that again, because it's part and parcel, obviously, but it's an important one, and I'm glad we got to talk about some different stuff. People from different backgrounds, different nationalities, Brits, Canadians. I'm sorry if I missed anybody else. Americans, sorry, our American friends to the south. So it's great. This is what I love. This is why the internet is amazing, and this is why this channel is great. Yes, it's Canadian military history, but we can bring that about however we like. And that's why I love this. And so your support would be amazing. Again, on Patreon, please, if you can become a supporter, it really helps me. The littlest amounts help me so much, just for long-term viability, but also building momentum. That's a big part of the online presence, is momentum. If I keep momentum going, the things will grow. People will see it. It sounds silly, but that's how these things happen. So if you can help, but anyway, subscribing, anything, liking, commenting, sharing the videos especially is very, very helpful, especially the smaller ones I do. If you can share those, that helps them as well. Like there's one coming up this week about the Halifax explosion. Please, if you can share that, that helps me an immense amount, because I'm only one person and I can only do so much. And it's just me in this operation on my own. So I need as much help as I can get. So again, thanks everybody. Again, don't forget to like the video of this one as well, because again, that helps. So please do. Thanks again, everyone. This was a great discussion. Thanks, everybody. Everyone seems to have enjoyed it. Got some good points in there. Everyone has an opinion on this, and everyone should share their opinion on this. You don't have to be an expert in any of these areas to show your thoughts. And I want to do this again, because I seem to be getting a lot of support for these types of live streams. So I definitely want to do them again, and I'll think about some stuff. But the next one is Hong Kong, so please do join me on Wednesday. And I'll be doing some more promotion for that. So everyone keep an eye out for that. Everyone enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye, everybody.